I will invite your attention back into the center of the room, folks. The fellowship is always a wonderful part of this, but we will get started now with the lecture portion of this morning's agenda. Do want to thank Mark for his leadership in worship, and all of those of you who were a part of leadership in that, a wonderful experience. Following this lecture now, we invite all of you to make your way to the dining hall, the Dunn Dining Hall up the hill. We have a new experience for you if you haven't been on campus for a while. We have a brand new farm-to-table operation here as a way of connecting and aligning some of the campus life with things we've been teaching for some time. We now have farmers on campus doing food production. That part is just getting started, and you will find that we are locally sourcing healthy foods, and it's been a wonderful experience. So please join us up the hill. Mark, please join us now.
All right, good morning again. So I want to talk for a little while today, kind of lay the groundwork in general about this idea of a prophetic ministry, and then maybe on tomorrow talk some more in specific details and some things that we've been doing in Philadelphia and things I think specifically the church, the church needs to be about. Can everybody hear me in the back? All right, great. So before going to Mother Bethel, I served a small AME church in Camden, New Jersey for about 5 years. I don't know if anybody knows anything about Camden, but right now Camden is considered to be one of the poorest cities in the country. At one point it had 150,000 residents. Now it's about 65 to 70,000 residents. White flight, black flight, Puerto Rican flight, anybody who had money left. And there's literally, it's the first city I've ever been in where there was no middle class, not at least one neighborhood where kind of, people who had money kind of held out, with the exception of 2 or 3 blocks. That's it, of just kind of decent housing. The majority of persons in Camden live below the poverty line, very troubled community. But I enjoyed it being there because, again, it reminded me of being in Oakland. Just didn't look like it, but again, the city in itself and the people did. It reminded me a lot of my experiences in Oakland growing up, and so I felt at home. And so our congregation started growing and was in a part of town that was industrialized. It was the oldest black church in the city, founded in the 1830s. That's kind of, I guess, I don't know, it seems like bishops never can send me anywhere except it's the oldest black church in the city. So, it's happened about like 5 of the 7 congregations I've served have been the first in the city. And so this particular part of town now, if you go there, the only thing left on this particular street, from one end of the block to the other, is that church. It's the only thing. In fact, I could always find it because it's under the flight path coming into Philadelphia. Philly, if you've flown in, you go out over Cherry Hill and you come back through Camden and land at the airport. And the landmarks are easy to find, but it's really easy to spot because, again, when it's the only building on a street, the blight stands out. I just look for the big empty lots, and there's the little red brick church, sitting there. So this church, we started trying to do things in the community, try to kind of reconnect with folk, because most of my members, like a lot of yours, drove in from the suburbs. Nobody lived within walking distance of the church except one family. Everybody else commuted in, and then, we were kind of like, it was like a fort in another country. We'd lock it up, ADT, and make sure, the natives didn't get in while we were gone, right? That's kind of how ministry has become in a lot of our churches. And so one of my staff persons got 5 or 6 big pallets of food donated. A real wooden pallet, food stacked up, and said, "Do you guys want it?" I said, "Sure." We know the people in the community want it. So they had it dropped off at the church, and we're looking around like, now, how do you give all this food away? The blessing is you have the food, but how do you give it away? So we sent flyers out at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon saying we're going to give food away at 6 o'clock, thinking, okay, maybe we'll get some of it moved today. I'm telling you, I mean, we just walked around the neighborhood and passed them out and passed them at the transportation center up there in town. And I'm talking about at 5:45. People were rolling in. I mean, cars with minivans, the doors are opening before they even like stopped. I mean, people like jumping out with bags, and just the food was just gone in like an hour. All that, I mean, the 5 pack, dude, just gone, empty. And so while we were outside, I'm in the parking lot, and there was, at this time, there was still like 2 abandoned houses behind the church before they had been torn down by the city. And I'm telling you, I never saw any movement in the house. I mean, they're dark, they're boarded up. And we see these boards at the bottom of the house start moving. And I look, and this guy crawls from under the house. I mean, from underneath the house, you know, dusts himself off, pulls his bag out, and just starts walking toward the church. And so he walks by me, and I'm thinking, man, I didn't know anybody lived in that house. And as I'm thinking this, he walks by me and says, man, I thought y'all were closed. I mean, you think you're doing ministry, right? And the abandoned house behind you, the guy who's like kind of squatting doesn't even realize the church is there. That's a real indictment, right? I mean, it really is. And it hit me like a brick. Like all the stuff you think you're doing inside, the singing, the shouting, the praise, the worship and the emphasis that we tend to put on the things of the church. And here it is, a guy who lives right behind us does not even know that we're present. And what that has really spoken to me is that we really have to be balanced in our approach toward ministry from the standpoint of the priestly and the prophetic, right? And no one can argue that the modern day church does the priestly well, right? I mean, the priestly is, the food pantry. What we were doing, giving the food out, that's the priestly role. Addressing this need of hunger in our neighborhood. People are hungry, we're going to give food away. That's the easy stuff. But it's important. But it's, you can write a check and do that. Right. The prophetic is dealing with, the systemic issues that cause hunger in the first place. Exactly. And dealing with the systemic issues that have created a community of have-nots and no-haves, and really no hope to be a have in that community. And that is the prophetic role, that there is a difference, and that I would argue the church has to be a part of both of those conversations. The priestly is when we go to the prisons and we have church services, we minister to people who are incarcerated. Absolutely, we're to do that. That's a part of our call. You read it in the Bible, we're told we'll be celebrated if we remember those who are in prison, chastised for when we forget. That's something we have to do. But the prophetic is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Exactly. And to talk about the issue of the inequity in the criminal justice system that has created really a mass incarceration industry, right? So the priestly then, goes into school and gives children backpacks and all of the nice little things you'd expect when you adopt a school. But again, the prophetic talks about the real issues that have created the differences based on zip code. So if you have the fortune of being born to parents in the right zip code, you get a great education, at least access to it. Whether you get it or not is up to you. But depending on what zip code you're born into, it's like rolling the dice. So the church, in my opinion, has to be both priest and prophet. And again, I'll say, I think we do the priestly role very well. But when it comes to the prophetic voice, the prophetic voice is strangely silent. I think, I'm trying to remember if some of the students here went with me to Payne a few years ago when I was teaching, I think one of the black history courses here, church history courses. And we went down to Payne Seminary. I don't know, Philip, were you with us when we went on there? No, okay. So James Cone was lecturing, and James Cone, who is an AME, said, we've got a lot of spirit in the church today. He said, I just don't know whose spirit it is. And I mean, talking about a prophetic word, right? That sums up kind of the contemporary church experience. And we've got a lot of things going on. Just don't know exactly where it comes from. Today, churches are bigger than they have ever been. I mean, who could have imagined the types of churches that we have today, the size of congregations? And I mean, I'm preaching to the choir in the Columbus area. I mean, you just drive up and down the interstate, and it's like, Lord, I mean, just, Potter's House and just everywhere you look. Is that like Walmart? No, that's a church. Just big churches, like everywhere, huge churches, right? And I don't knock mega churches. I mean, it's not your fault that you started growing and kept growing. That's not, you can't criticize somebody for that. The commission is to go out and to, disciple people and to teach people. So that's wonderful that the church grows. And it's almost an American trend that we do everything big now. So the corner store is gone, right? The hardware store is gone. The florist is gone. All of those things have become Walmart, they're Target, they're Myers. So everything is under one roof. The movie theater that used to be on Broad Street or Main Street is, now the 24-plex. I mean, it's just kind of, this who we are right now. I mean, of course, things tend to change. I wouldn't be surprised if the trend goes the other direction with the next generation or two. But in churches, it's the same trend. People want everything under one roof. They want the big church experience. So that's understandable. So I'm not here to knock large churches or large church pastors. The issue is not the size of the congregation or the building that they worship in, but the issue is the impact that the church has on the community and in the world around it. I mean, it seems strange to me that the bigger the churches become, seems like the less impact they have on social change. Huge congregations, and yet nothing changes. In Philadelphia, one of the biggest churches is in the middle of nothing. Beautiful building. Beautiful building. And the neighborhood around it just looks like, a war zone. Just seems strange to me. It seems like that same prosperity that's happening inside those four walls should spill over into the community around you. And yet, everything is focused on the inside of the building, and nothing is focused around the community. And a part of that, I would argue, is that that there is a reluctance to be prophetic. Because being prophetic comes with a cost. Right? Everybody knows that. You speak up, off with your head, right? So who wants all that trouble? Now I have to be careful how I say this part, because I did a part of this lecture before where I talked about this. This young lady afterwards just jumped up and she was so angry with me. So I said, let me just always preface this statement, So I have no problems with Joel Osteen as a person. Let me just say that, okay? I do not. If you read his books, if you have them in your car right now or on your device, if you watch him, I'm not here to criticize him as a person, all right? I think he's very happy, one of the happy. I'm just saying. One of the happiest persons that I've seen on TV. And if I had 40,000 members, I'd be happy too. Just a tenth of that, I'd be happy. So, but 40,000 members, millions of viewers, arguably the most well-known preacher of the gospel in America, right? More famous than T.D. Jakes, Creflo, anybody. He is just, Joel Osteen is it right now, right? He's got it. And, worships there and where the Houston Rockets used to play. Like, you need a basketball arena to have church. Good God. Every Sunday, just packed, right? And so Osteen was asked by the Christian Post. They were doing an interview with him. It was kind of like a puff piece, really. It's just, tell us about you and your wife, your marriage, how does it feel to be the pastor? Your dad was a pastor here. Then they asked him kind of, a question I wouldn't have expected from them, right? They asked him, should Christians boycott businesses for any reason as an act of protest? And then they said, for instance, the abolitionists boycotted sugar plantations that used slave labor. That's a deep question. So Joel's answer is, and I quote, He said, my thing would be everybody's got to run their own race. So I wouldn't tell somebody to or not to. Some people feel called to do different things. I try to stay in my lane. And I'm not an authority on whether they should. I would tell them to do what you felt God has told you to do. End quote. That's America's most influential, if by American standards, influential is numbers and money, and it usually is. The most influential preacher in America's response to a question about if you were around during the time of slavery, would you have used your influence to stop it? Well, you know. And historically, there are a whole lot of preachers who've had that same answer. Right? And I mean, unless we think it's just Joel Osteen, even our own, sainted Father Richard Allen, our founder, yesterday as we celebrated the Founders Day, as I said, we had this really powerful experience through worship, through the arts, and it was just a great experience. Jarena Lee was the first woman preacher in the AME church. Jarena Lee came to Richard Allen and said to him that God is calling me to preach. And Richard Allen, sounding just like the white Methodist that he left, quoted the discipline. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? And Richard Allen said, the discipline has nothing in it about women preachers. I don't know what to tell you. You know what I mean? And so 8 years goes by, and she has this epiphany in the middle of worship. A preacher is up preaching, not Richard Allen. He's in the congregation, and the preacher is preaching the text that she'd been reading the night before, meditating on, Jonah chapter 2, verse 9. And he loses the spirit, as they say. Back then, that's what they called it. Today, we call it flunking, right? He just lost it, and she jumped up and started preaching the text from the congregation. When she finished, she sat down, just knew Richard Allen would kick her out of the church. But Allen got up, and it converted Allen, and it pushed him, and he told the congregation, 8 years ago she came to me, I told her no, but clearly this is God's work. And so that for all of us, sometimes we need that push, that external force that makes us do that which is uncomfortable. And churches by nature as institutions are uncomfortable about doing things that seem risky, right? I was in an AME meeting. Are we recording this? That's all right. I'll tell that story another time. I like being the pastor of Mother Bethel, so I want to try to stay there a few more years. But what if Joel Osteen came out and said, I think the president is right. The minimum wage is too low. And not only should it be 10-10, because I thought that was like kind of a weak compromise. It really, if you talk to anybody who studies the numbers, it should be $15 an hour to keep up with current inflation and then keep going up, not every 10 or 15 years. And so what if Joel Osteen said from the pulpit, said that, that the Bible I read says that we should not oppress the worker. That I think that if Walmart and US Air and American Airlines and GM and everybody else can make billions of dollars, that the wealth should be shared with the people who help make it, and that there shouldn't be poor people who work for a living. That you shouldn't work 40 hours a week, 60 hours a week, and still need food stamps to make a difference. In case you don't know, that's what a lot of folk have to do today. Husband and wives both work, and they still need food stamps, right? What would happen if Joel Osteen said, this is what I support? Do you think something wouldn't happen? That things wouldn't begin changing? What if Osteen in Texas weighed in on the immigration reform debate and said, remember, you were strangers once, biblically and culturally. Don't forget the stranger in your midst. That there is this absence of a prophetic voice, often from those who have the most influence. And sometimes we need an external push. Being priest and prophet is not an option. It's an imperative. That we've not been called to say you can be either one. That we've been called to be both. And I've got biblical backup for that. All right? You remember Elisha? One of my favorite stories, I love preaching this story, 2 Kings 4, 1 through 7, the widow with the oil. Yes. That thing will preach, I'll tell you. You know what I mean? She just kept pouring and pouring and pouring, and God filled up the vessels, and, you know, she sold them, went in the energy business, and paid for her kids to go to college and all of that stuff. So this widow who is married to a seminarian who died suddenly, he was in Elisha's school, right? Dies suddenly, and she has nowhere to turn. She goes to Elisha, says, you know, my husband, your servant, passed away, but the debts lived on. And this is a priestly function. You know, she can't pay her bills. The creditor's going to take her children. And she said, what can you do for me? And Elisha says, okay, tell you what you do. So he gives her, you know, the prescription, and the miracle happens. But, you know, you have to read that story in the context of that entire section. I know there's probably at least one or two biblical professors in here somewhere, right, who can kind of attest to this, that you can't just read it in isolation. That the previous chapter deals with Elisha out with these kings on this wild venture to go fight their enemies. They get lost, about to die of thirst. And when they bring Elisha in and say, you know, man of God, is there a word from the Lord? Elisha says, yeah, there's a word. But first, let me tell you something, king. I never liked you anyway. You know, I didn't like your daddy Ahab, your mama Jezebel. I mean, you just come from wicked people. And so this is your own fault. And so we should let you die out here. He said, but because of Jehoshaphat and my love for him and respect for him, I'm going to tell you what God said. But I mean, that's truth speaking. That's being prophetic. Not, you know, forecasting into the future what the number will be so people can hit it. That is telling truth to power. So that on one hand, 1 minute he's dealing on this high level stuff, dealing with this monarch that's lost his way. And then the next minute he's dealing with something as mundane as this woman who's in need. You know, I got a text just a minute ago in between services. One of my members who was at church yesterday, her mother passed suddenly in Atlanta. You know, I mean, this is great being here, but there are these real priestly needs that folk have that are waiting back at home. And that is what the church is at its best. It is not either or, it is both and. And that we've lost the prophetic part of our edge. And as a result, the church often just kind of looks like an appendage to everything else. We're there to bless the food at the mayor's ball. You know, we're there to pray at the opening of the State House session. You know, we're there as kind of, you know, like jewelry and accessories. And that's how people in power like the church. Quiet and decorative. Great place to come and talk. But that's not the only thing we've been called to do, in my opinion. In fact, you remember, I think you guys remember Dietrich Bonhoeffer, don't you? Normally when I talk about this stuff, nobody knows who I'm talking about. You know, they think he's like an actor or something. He's got a cool name. But that's what he was talking about. This stuff about cheap grace, right? But he said cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. I mean, in other words, you know, cheap grace is preaching the gospel of Jesus that does not have a cross, that doesn't require anything. There's no sacrifice to be made. You can't follow Jesus and your life not change. And you don't go, I mean, didn't he say the student is not above the teacher? Whatever the teacher went through, then the student has to go through as well. You know, we want to follow, but we don't want anything to change. I was in a meeting the other day with some clergy. We do community organizing. I'm going to talk about some of that tomorrow. And, you know, she was making the point that these were new clergy we were trying to bring into the work. And she was saying that all the churches she pastored, None of them have ever been involved in, anything that could be considered controversial or prophetic or anything of that nature. And then she made, I thought, was a startling, conclusion. She said, I don't know if it's the churches I served or if it's me. I said, man, that's deep. I think she was trying to be funny, but I think it was real. Congregations tend to take personalities of their pastors, right? That's what happens. Black church, white church, brown church, yellow church, it doesn't matter. That's just kind of how the nature of human beings are. And so Bonhoeffer goes on to say that what we need is not cheap grace, but costly grace. Costly grace confronts us as a gracious call to follow Jesus. It comes as a word of forgiveness to the broken spirit and the contrite heart. It's costly because it compels, and I'll say a person to submit to the yoke of Christ, to follow Christ. It is grace because Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The stuff I'm talking about is not new. We've always had the real preachers of LA. and I'm sad to say they just renewed their contract with Oxygen for a second season. That's just terrible, isn't it? It is, I tell you, it's a comedy or a tragedy, right? But they're not new. They're in the Bible. Remember Gehazi, Elijah, heals Naaman and lets Naaman off. Naaman wants to pay for it with all that silver and gold and the suits he brought. And Elisha says, no, because I don't want you to think you can buy what God gives. Go on back, to Syria. You're healed now. So Gehazi says, you can't let him off like that. Runs behind him, says, oh, my master changed his mind. Give me that money. Don't act like you all would have done it, right? Tries to get the money, comes back, and guess what? Naaman's curse falls on him, right? The 7 sons of Sceva. See what Paul is doing. They said, man, that's good business. If we can heal people like that, we can get paid. So in the name of Jesus, that Paul preaches about, come out. And the demon jumps on him and beats his clothes, beats all of their clothes off. That's a bad demon. And so we've always had people like that. The difference is, and this is what I would argue, is that in the past, they were outliers, right? No, it was kind of out on the fringes and the margins, that it was not necessarily considered normative. Back then, if you listened to Creflo or the Creflo of his day, Father Divine, Daddy Grace, if you listened to them back in the day, you would never tell anybody, right? But I was in I will say, I was in an AME meeting, and I was talking about this, and when I talked about Osteen, after in the Q&A, an AME preacher stood up in front of a bunch of other AME pastors, and she just took me to task. She talked about Joel Osteen. I said, whoa. What shocked me was not her stance. I respect the right is that an AME preacher in an AME meeting defending Joel Osteen 20 years ago would have never happened. And so today, the difference is that to talk about a prophetic ministry or a ministry that comes with a cost and sacrifice is on the outside and sounds strange. And that ministry that says that God wants you to prosper just for the sake of prospering, not to do anything with it, but that the sign of being blessed by God is that you've got money in the bank and no problems with your health, that has become mainstream, and that what at least we thought to be normative before has become something that is strange and different. When you got to try to argue with people about the cross, the way of the cross, and not just people to Christians, that is a marked difference in where we are today. And so it's hard for the prophetic voice to get a hearing in a world like that. When to talk about the stuff I've been talking about sounds strange. It's like, Reverend, that's not what I heard on TV. That's not what any of my favorite preachers talk about. In fact, they say if you had trouble, then trouble is just a sign that, you're not in line with God. Something wrong with your faith. And so the poor folk are poor not because of a system or a systemic problem, but because they don't have faith. Where is the counter argument to that? And who's to offer it? Or do we just simply give up and just, allow them to just dominate the conversation? So I'm going to stop it right there, and I'm going to open it up for a little bit of conversation, because I get tired of hearing myself talk. And so, I'm interested in how any of that resonates with you, if at all. I know somebody has a question in the form of a sermon out there. Oh, Sister Rebecca, yes.
It seems to me that I can't think of a preacher that is outstanding since maybe the 60s or 70s. And it seems to me that this is reflective in the church of what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
That we are scared. We don't want to lose our job. And we get paid pretty well. So, what's your take on that besides Joel Osteen?
That's an outstanding question. Let me just try to address it. Immediately, once you said that, the person who popped in my mind is Jeremiah Wright.
Yes.
Now, I mean, and sometimes people take issue with him because, again, your opinion of him has been formed by Fox News with a loop of a sermon. His 9/11 sermon, I guarantee you, is one of the best sermons I've ever heard. I mean, you only have to like him to admit at the end, it's like, good God, that was a great sermon. But the part about the chickens coming home to roost was taken out and put into a loop. I played the 9/11 sermon at my church in Camden, and I had Mark Lamont Hill, who you see on CNN now, and he was on Fox at one time, became a comment. He was like Bill O'Reilly's Democratic foil, but Mark is from Philly, good guy. So I had him come to my church on that Sunday. That was the sermon. I did not preach, and we, advertised it to get, press out. We played the sermon as though Jeremiah Wright was to introduce him and everything, and the sermon went, and my folk were almost shouting in the church. And so then Mark came to give kind of the response to it. I mean, it was amazing. But what happened to Jeremiah Wright during the Obama, run up to his election in 2008 is why you don't have more Jeremiah Wrights. Who wants to go through all that hell? I mean, he spent his life building what is probably one of as I've been talking about, priestly and prophetic. You want to see the model of that? Go to Trinity UCC in Chicago. You will see the model of it. A church that knows is prophetic enough to have influence in Chicago politics and in the state. And Otis Moss III, he was at Morehouse when I was at Clark, so we've known each other for a number of years, is doing a great job at, carrying that tradition. But people are reluctant to put themselves out there like that when it means that you're going to become a martyr simply for speaking the truth. And so when given the choice between the two, frankly, most people are afraid. As you said, well paid. Preachers today, my goodness. My mother sometimes looks at me, she said, Russ, I don't understand this. She worked all these years at the post office, became a supervisor. She sees what preachers make today. She shakes her head like something is wrong. You know what I mean? And who wants to sacrifice that? Bishop calling you and telling you got to stop talking about this stuff, I'm going to move you. Or if you're in a church that hires the pastor, having that kind of pressure from whatever that governing body is. For Jeremiah Wright, he was at retirement, so he didn't care. He was coming out anyway. And if you know Jeremiah Wright, he still doesn't care. Even if he was young, he wouldn't care. That's Jeremiah Wright. But where are those voices? Whether you agree with his take on the world or not is not the issue. But where are those voices? And where are they in large numbers? They're just missing. Great question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Here's my cliche story and my cliche question. So about 10, 12 years ago, I guess I started seminary, earnest young white girl, right? And took all the social justice courses and got really excited and did, got out in the community and we were protesting this war and that war.
Well, only if you'll sign a waiver that says if you get fired, you won't sue me. Yeah, okay. I mean, it's, you talk about this, it is a real struggle. And again, a lot of it always comes back to self-interest, right? I mean, why do people tend to do things? A lot of times the first issue is, does this meet my self-interest, right? And when you're an associate, it's a much more difficult place than when you're the senior pastor. I mean, when you're the senior pastor, you don't have to worry about those kind of issues. And, some could argue that's even more pressure because you don't have an excuse, right? And so that if you don't do it or say it, I mean, who's stopping you? So, but in an associate role, I say that I would suggest that you begin at least creating a model that's going to work for you, when and if you become a senior pastor, and begin to do what you can within that context. Because again, it's, people tend to, when you get to a certain level of influence, you tend to continue to carry on what you've already been doing. I mean, there's always this great hope that when I finally make it up there, then I'm going to, kind of come out of this Trojan horse and show everybody who I really am, this revolutionary. But it doesn't happen that way. Black folk have been waiting for Clarence Thomas to do that for years, right? It's like, one day, Clarence is going to start actually speaking at the Supreme Court, Just doesn't happen. I mean, he is, I would give him credit, he's consistent. He is who he has always been, And so I'd say at least begin with what you can do and what you have been given responsibility over, to begin to create your own model, because again, you'll carry it. I've noticed, and it was never intentional, I've just noticed that in my ministry today, that it looks a lot like it did in '94 at my first church. Though in '94, it was unsophisticated. I didn't realize what it was. It was, at that time, in Jefferson City, Missouri, at my first church, it was like the civil rights movement passed over Jefferson City. I mean, seriously, there was never a protest in the history of Jeff City. They just kind of waited for St. Louis and Kansas City to work it out, and then they reaped the benefits that came to them. So in the 90s, it felt like it was the 50s, and there was an incident at the school that kind of galvanized this new group of clergy persons together into a unit, because there were two groups of kids, black kids and white kids, fighting after school. Who hadn't seen that movie before? So that's what happens, right? So the kids line up again, and I'm with my side, you're with your side. They fight. They're high school students. But when the cops came, they literally arrested all the black kids and they took them all to jail and put some of them in adult lockup. They didn't arrest like any white kids. It was just, it was so amazing. And I'm sitting there and all the black people in Jeff City were like, well, that's what happens. Like, really? So clergy, we got together. Now, mind you, we didn't know what we were doing, but we went to the community center. It was the only thing that was kind of a shared piece of property in our community, and gathered the parents of those kids. Some of them had still not even seen or been able to talk to their kids. This is, high school students, and the parents can't talk to their children incarcerated. And so, we marched on up, to the school district office and did a few other things. But as I look back over my ministry, it's been consistently in that direction. No matter where it's been, La Jolla or Oxford, Ohio, or wherever. And so you have to develop your own, because again, it's not just going to happen 20 years down the road in the ministry. And so, you might get in trouble with your senior pastor, but it might be a good thing. Sometimes being put out of places is a sign that you're on the right track. When folk who are not doing right are not bothered by you, it probably means you're not either. Somebody ought to say amen. Yeah. You can use that for a sermon on Sunday. Other questions, comments? Yes. One of our former students.
For those of us who are students and are still learning, do you have any suggestions for us as to when to try to be prophetic and when to be humble?
Yeah, it's, life is funny. If you think about it, so if you think about moments when you let opportunities pass by, that, that the moment, that those moments are always, they always present themselves, right? Moses, went about it the wrong way the first time, kills the Egyptian. But, I mean, it's not like he woke up that morning and said, I'm going to start this prophetic ministry. He just went out and he saw something that was wrong, and something in him just said, I can't let this keep happening. Probably wasn't the first time he saw a Hebrew being beaten by an Egyptian. It was probably everyday occurrence, but something, it was that moment. He thought he can get away with it too, by the way, which he didn't. But I mean, and again, that was, as we would see later in the call that when God calls him and commissions him, it's a different approach. And it's successful, but that there are always opportunities around us. Just read the newspaper. A part of it is getting hooked up with people who are on the same agenda. And I'm going to talk about some of that tomorrow, about some of our community organizing work, because when you get with folk who are together, sometimes just opportunity, you're prepared, you're organized, so when the opportunity presents itself, you're ready to do something about it. 2 weeks ago, we were in a clergy caucus with our group in Philadelphia, and there was a couple, the Garcia family in Philadelphia. They were arrested, husband and wife, just like the woman up in Akron. You guys are all familiar with that story, right? She was arrested for stealing education. She sent her kids to an affluent district using her dad's address a few years ago, and arrested and convicted for a felony, did jail time. Same thing happened to a woman in Connecticut. She had other issues as well, but she's still in jail. But this couple used the dad's address in Philly. They were, booked. You stole from Lower Moreland School. Nobody talks about the governor who took $1 billion out of education and used it to build prisons instead. That's theft as well, but he's out living in the mansion. But they were arrested. And so the trial was about to start that same day, and it just happened to be on the day of the clergy caucus. Now, one of the things we're fighting for in Pennsylvania now, because we realize you can't just have a win in Philadelphia, you need the entire state to be on board. We're fighting for an education formula that will be consistent regardless of who the governor is, Democrat, Republican, white, black, whatever, that the funding formula will become sacred and will not be, touched. So this issue spoke directly to what we were talking about. This is flesh on the bones, right? This is the word made living. That the fact that this couple has to take their kids and try to sneak them in someone else's school district because they know education is the pathway to success in America, and they're not going to get it in the zip code they live in, but they can't afford to move to another one, right? And yet they become villains. And they're the ones that are wrong, not this system that created this inequity, as though the way we fund schools fell from heaven. And God forbid anybody change what God created. God said it must be this way. No, we don't fund highways that way. You don't drive down I-70 when you go through the poor part of the state. All of a sudden there's big potholes in the road. And it's like, sorry, you're in the poor part of Ohio. It'll get better. Just keep driving. You know what I mean? You better hope that the bridge you're riding on is not in a poor zip code. No, nobody. We don't think that way, right? So there's certain things that we just realize are in the best interest of everybody. Education the same way. So when we heard that story, we were like, you know what? In the clergy caucus, this is a great opportunity. Let's talk to this family. So we've been trying to reach them and find out. They settled that same day. So they didn't actually settle before we could even reach out to them. They avoided jail time by admitting they were wrong. Dad is going to pay back $11,000 for money he stole. We're going to help them try to raise the money for it. But again, that doesn't necessarily leap out at you from the paper. I think that what has to happen is, Nicole, you have to get into that, when you kind of get into the flow of this, of just like the priestly part. If you see a concern, if there's a building caught on fire, family gets burned out, what does your church do? You got to respond to that. We're going to take an offering on Sunday because you're in that flow of the priestly, right? And when you're in the flow of the prophetic, it's the same thing. That when you see things that just speak to you, it's like, whoa, we can't let that happen. Somebody's got to say something. Who's going to say it? Who else is going to say it? My members, they really have good jobs. I don't want them to get fired, right? Because they get fired, nobody will, But that's what I'm paid for. I'm paid to have the freedom to speak. I say what you can't say, as comedians say, I say what's on your mind that you really want to say. I got CEOs I mean, some very affluent folk in my church. I mean, they are paid, and they, but they can't go out there and say this stuff. But they're happy that I do. And that's why they keep coming back to that church. So you have to get into that flow, just like we're in the other flow. Other questions? We got a couple of minutes. Yes.
Hi, Judy Austin. I'm an MDiv student at United.
Okay.
By day, I'm a professor at Ashland University. I teach leadership. A part of this prophetic on the personal level is the authenticity in being able to live the authentic life and knowing self. And so often, folks in ministry don't connect to knowing self. Because authenticity is a two-sided coin. My authentic self is not the same as yours, and I might not agree with your authentic self, right? And so, but we all have to find our space in the ministry and in the prophetic call to do that which we feel that we are set on this earth to do. The thing that I tell my students often is, ask yourself one simple question. Is this the hill on which I wish to die? Is this the hill on which I wish to lose my home? Is this the hill on which I wish to lose my everything that I've come to know as the tangible things that make me comfortable to do what I need to do? But you have to know self in order to be able to walk the prophetic sometimes.
Yeah, and so you teach leadership. So can you just talk just quickly about how important leadership is in all of this?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, sorry.
This is Judy. She teaches leadership at Ashland.
Leadership is a quality that we all have. Some say you're born with it, some say you're made. Yeah, all of that. But there is a space in the universe for you to step out and do that which you've been called to do, which you've been purposed to do by God. And that is leadership in its essence. I do research on women in leadership and universities in leadership. And there's one piece that really, I think, speaks more to this than anything else, and it's what we call tempered radicalism, which means that I will stay in the boat, but I will rock the boat and try to steer it in a different direction.
Tempered radicalism.
Tempered radicalism. And so I may not like the organization of which pays the bills at my house, but I'm there in my authenticity and guiding it in a different direction, subversively sometimes, but subversive can be good. But I'm not going to leave that boat because I think that God has purposed me in this life to help make it a better organization. And so therefore I'm not going to get out of the boat, because once I get out of the boat, what can I do, right, to make the organization better? So in my leadership position, which also means that sometimes I'm in a followership position, I can steer the oars in a different direction, and they may not even realize that it's changing because it changes slowly.
So, I mean, that sounds like, one of the rationales for why in the 1800s when blacks had an opportunity to leave, free blacks, and go back to Africa, that it was that same idea that, no, we're vested in it. We want to try to, to your point, try to do what we can, within the context. But I think that, the idea of leadership itself is really at the crux of this, right? That, that leadership means taking risks. If you don't want to take, if you don't want to take risks, I understand it. But, to do this, if you think about the Bible, all those folk that you get to so when I get to the end of my sermons, I kind of go through that litany of, heroes and heroines, like Esther did. And, so you kind of go through that list. These were risk takers, these were folk who sometimes did risk their lives. In that, again, in this meeting that was at last week with these Montgomery County clergy, the faith, we always start our organizing with a faith reflection. Somebody gives a reflection based on their faith tradition. And this rabbi got up to talk about Esther. And I was like, man, I'm going to preach that. He said that, I've seen this before, but just never made the connection. He was like, that nowhere in the book is God's name mentioned. That God is not mentioned in Esther. And his take on it was that means that that this story reminds us that if it's going to be, it's going to be because some of us get together and do something that's right. That God is not going to come save us from this. God won't save us from Haman. Mordecai says, you have to do it. And if you don't do it, help will come from somewhere else. And some people say he was alluding to God. Others say maybe just somebody else who would come offer leadership in that moment. And she said, but I can't, because if I go in there and I'm not summoned, what's going to happen? Off with my head. Everybody knows that, right? I'm going to be like Jeremiah Wright. You know what I mean? If I speak up and the king doesn't call me, I'm dead. No, I'm just talking about losing house, job, property. You're talking about losing everything. That's the ultimate price. And yet Esther takes a risk. Daniel takes a risk. He prays with his window open. Going to get thrown in the lion's den. I don't know what God's going to do. The 3 Hebrew boys say, we know God can save us from the fire. But even if God doesn't save us, we will not worship your statue. That the Bible is filled with characters who take risks. And when you take the risk, I just believe, going back to sermon mode, that to me, that's, where you really want to see the power of God manifest. It's when you put yourself out there and you can't save yourself. that this is beyond my capacity. And that, that God, I'm laying everything out here, not because I just want to be, a leader or anything else, but I'm putting it out here because, I feel convicted that this is the right thing for me to do. Associate, sometimes, God, this may cause me to lose my job. This pastor, I'll fall out of favor with the senior pastor. And he or she will want to ship me off somewhere else. I'm going to take a risk of faith. And that, again, going back to my original, critique is that the church today does not want to take risks. That's the most stuff I hear all the time from clergy that I do work with, and the ones who, who are resistant to this is, it's always about but what if this happens? What if that happens? What if we lose this? What if we lose that? And again, it's always about yourself. But, I know too much about God to worry about that. So my ministerial career has been written off a few times, and people still wonder how I got to Mother Bethel. Folk who wrote my ministerial obituary, and they look at me like, how in the... It doesn't make sense. But you just have to just trust God with some stuff. That's all I can say. Yes, sir. Another former student.
Yeah.
How's Michigan?
When it comes to risk taking, do you see where our church's structures are promoting this acquiescence to not taking risks? To say that, well, if you take this risk, you may lose some members. If you lose members, you lose money. If you lose money, you can't pay your apportionments. You can't do this,
Talk
that,
now.
and the other. Okay? I think that we have bought into that safety zone, that politically, socially, religiously acceptable mode of being preachers, teachers, pastors, lay servants, not stepping out in the courage of our convictions because this may happen, that might happen.
So like you, United Methodist folk, us AMEs also have, we call them conference claims. In fact, I just sent a big check off last week, And, I will admit that, being risky and being what I, would consider to be prophetic, you will lose some members. Absolutely. I guarantee it. And the more risky you take, because some folk just don't want to be part of anything like that. They don't want to be associated with it. They can't handle it at the hairdresser when people tell them about, your pastor's so radical. What's wrong with your church? And I'm telling you, they see folk down in the grocery store, the barbershop, wherever else. And they get it from their friends and family. And some people will leave you. Remember John? I always remember. I only, trust me, I can't remember, biblical verses like that. So don't get impressed by this. But John 6:66, because it's 666. That's why I remember. Jesus is talking about the risks and the cost of discipleship. And a group of people just say, you know what, man, this is too much. We thought this was about free fish and bread. Heal a few sick people. Hey, we're going. We'll see you later. And they turn and leave. And looks at, Peter and the rest and says, you all leaving too? You're like, some people are going to leave you. But the grace is that when you stand with the power of conviction, you will draw people who are not already there. And the people who are drawn to you because of the power of your conviction, you won't lose those people. And the more authentic you become, thank you for that, Doc, the more powerful your ministry becomes. Because it's really who you are. It's nothing worse than to be in ministry and to be fake. Nothing worse than to have to bite your tongue and to be able to, watch stuff happen that you don't agree with. And it's wrong. And God has told you in your spirit that it's not right. And yet you gotta, you go by it and I'm gonna tell you, it will eat away at you like a cancer. You do that for 10 to 20 years. It's better just to be yourself and let the chips fall where they'll fall. And I tell you again, as people leave, as the old folks say in my tradition, God will raise friends up for you. People who will come, this had nothing to do with being prophetic, but I remember I cut fundraising out in my first church. I hate fundraisers. Because it's easy, it's a cop-out. I don't have to tithe if I fundraise. And the biggest fundraisers didn't give a dime of their own money. I contribute. I do Women's Day. That's $10,000 a year. Yeah, but why don't you tithe? The Bible doesn't talk about fundraising, it talks about tithe. So this is not prophetic. This is just my take on church leadership, And so a woman, I told we'd stop the fundraising, and my officer came. He said, Reverend, oh, that's it. Oh, you just messed up now. That's it. It's over. It was going so well. And I said, Doc, I can't tell you. This is my conviction. Do you know later that month, a new doctor from Michigan and his family moved to the church? And this brother started tithing off his check 10%. It was her fundraiser and somebody else's and all of that in one. And tithers don't stop tithing, when they get a little upset because they're not giving to you or to the church. They give to God. But my point is that when you do what you feel convicted, you will lose some, but what you gain in the process far surpasses what you think you've lost. I'm sorry, hand in the back. Yes.
I just wanted to read something. I am a former student of so I graduated in 07 in the MACA program.
Amen.
After 66, I'm in the Aspen program with the doctor of ministry. So
All right.
I like getting affirmation, so I'm still working on it. But this is something from the diary of John Wesley. It's an unknown author, so I don't know if it's true. Maybe some of you all have heard this. It says Sunday a.m. May 5th. Priest in St. Anne's was asked not to come back in.
Wow.
May 5th, Priest in St. John's, deacon said, get out and stay out. Sunday a.m. May 12th, Priest in St. Jude, can't go back there either. Sunday a.m. May 19th, Priest in St. somebody else's, deacons called special meeting and said I couldn't return.
Wow.
Sunday p.m. May 19th, preached on street, kicked off street. Sunday a.m. May 26th, preached in Meadow, chased out of Meadow and turned loose doing service. Sunday a.m. June 2nd, preached out at the edge of town, kicked off the highway. Sunday p.m. June 2nd, afternoon, preached in a pasture, 10,000 people came out to hear me.
Wow. That's amazing. Thank you for that. I'm going to see you at lunch, hopefully, so I can I want to get the link to where that book is. That's so powerful. Yes, sir, in the back.
I've toyed with this over my ministry, the relationship between the priestly and the prophetic function. Most of my pastors were in urban areas where I could be prophetic as I wanted to be, and nobody thought anything of it. And I also was an executive director of the social justice ministry, so God and God's sense of humor sent me to a suburban congregation. where they get most of their news off of Fox.
Yeah.
And the first time in my life, I've been accused by folks of not being prophetic anymore. But when I go into the pulpit, folks hear things from me I don't even have to say. One Sunday, a woman told me she was tired of me talking about the poor. I went back and listened to the sermon, and I made one passing reference to the poor in the whole context of it. But I guess what I kind of see in this, it is through the priestly function that I am able to speak to them. And if I don't with the priestly function, they will never hear me. And just to be prophetic for prophetic's sake may make you feel good, but you may not accomplish anything.
So true. I mean, again, it's, listen, I mean, sermons, especially when you preach to folk people come to church with all kind of issues. And most of the time, they're not thinking about the big stuff, right? And sometimes, part of the role is to help people connect, however, that, your experience does fit into a larger story, into a larger narrative, right? But you're right that there's a way that you have to live this out. And I don't think that, given the world the way that it is now, it's not like you have to be prophetic for the sake of being prophetic. I'm telling you, there's always something that is really calling us and demanding us. I was in a meeting not too long ago, and we started talking about some things that were pretty risky. And I'm telling you, the person who was leading the group, jumped to the mic quick and shut the whole conversation down. They just didn't want it to even go there, right? And so that's what happens. Now, I think that it's lunchtime, and I want to close with this quote from Martin Niemöller. That's something that I'm sure that all you seminarians have said. You probably have it like, as wallpaper on your computers and all that stuff. But it's so true about what happens when the church is silent, right? You remember Niemöller silently sat by during Nazi Germany's rise and was comfortable because, from his context, they weren't looking for him. But again, it's something I always remember because most of us say, when we see things that are happening, that's not my issue, right? What does that broken school system mean to me? Because my kids are in a great school, right? But Niemöller says, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. All right, so we're going to lunch. Thank you.